Nyanyana Evelyn Araluen, thank you so much for joining us today. If you haven't already, you might want to just grab your seat when you can, with all manner of COVID-safe distancing that you are able to enforce. I would like to begin by thanking Giranyadama and Still Briggs for the Welcome to Country that began today's proceedings, and also would like to myself acknowledge that we are meeting here on stolen country. It is country that, as we will be discussing in the proceedings of today's panel conversation, it is country that is not being cared for in the way that it should, as all stolen and unceded land across Australia has been in the aftermath of colonisation and invasion. We are all, at this panel, we are all Aboriginal people, but we are guests on this country, and as such, we are acting in our best honour and accountability towards the continuing custodianship of this land. I'm very grateful to have been protected by that sovereignty throughout the pandemic here, and I give my thanks to the Kulin Nations, particularly to Woiwurrung Wurundjeri and to Boon Wurrung, for their ongoing care and custodianship of their homelands. To begin, I just want to just briefly preface this by saying that we're meeting here as part of the Gribble Argument event, which is in honour of the late Gribble, a true force in Australian cultural and intellectual life. This year, the 2020 Gribble Argument responds to the issue of climate change. Teila Watson, aka Ancestress, Victor Steffensen and Bruce Pascoe have written essays discussing and reflecting on issues of climate change, environment and connection to country. You can read the full essays at the Wheeler Centre's website, wheelercentre.com. Today, we were unfortunately not able to hear from Teila due to the ongoing COVID-19 situation in Brisbane, but you had me standing in, and I hope you're all really, I hope that was sufficient. It's not sufficient, she's amazing, but I did my best. We've also heard from Victor in the flesh and a host of other speakers who've offered different generational perspectives on climate management and caring for country, speaking from a body of knowledge that has been silenced since invasion. Before we begin today's discussion, I would also like to acknowledge the key partners that have made today's event possible: Creative Partnerships Australia, Creative Victoria, the City of Melbourne, and all of the Wheeler Centre's donors and supporters, a number of whom are with us today. Thank you. These are really important conversations, and it does actually take industry organising, participation and support to enable these sorts of dialogues. So we really actually do appreciate people ensuring that as a part of their work, whether that is corporate work, whether that is government work, whatever kind of work, that we are able to, as much as possible, talk about climate, and when we do that work, we are able to centre Indigenous perspectives as much as possible. Unfortunately, due to COVID restrictions, we will not be having an audience Q&A, but following the discussion, you are able to go over and get books signed. Uncle Bruce's book will be there and he will be able to sign books. Potentially mine will be, I'm not actually sure. Maybe if it's there and you'd like it, if you're into poetry, it might be there. We can all find out together. And then the last thing, I would also just really like to thank our Auslan interpreters for the day, Linda Dornay and Amber Richardson. They're doing a really terrific job, and it's incredibly important. We have this accessibility as a part of all of our work here. So, enough rambling. Brave old world. I might actually just ask if you guys would be okay with just introducing yourself and introducing a little bit of the work that you are doing around climate justice and organising at the moment. And we will start to my immediate left with you, Uncle Bruce.
G'day, I'm Bruce Pascoe. I'm a Ewan Bunurong Tasmanian man, and I work on a farm at Mallacoota, Far East Gippsland, and we're growing the old foods, the grains and the tubers that I talk about in Dark Emu. And my son on my left is on the board. Zena bought my shirt, so it's all a little bit indulgent. But we're trying to show that we can grow the old Aboriginal foods because they're better for country. They're perennial, and therefore there's no ploughing. They don't need artificial fertilisers, extra water, pesticides, so they're better for country, but they're also highly nutritious. And we hope to crop those plants with local Aboriginal labour to show that Aboriginal unemployment, Aboriginal low education rates are not necessary. They're just built into the institution at the moment. We have to change the institution. So thank you.
Jack Pascoe. I'm a Yuin Grungy man with that heritage. I'm an ecologist by trade, which is a strange kind of cancer, but we study ecosystems. I did a PhD out of University of Western Sydney where I studied apex predators, but since then I've spent a lot of time working in applied ecology, so a lot of work with fire and a lot of work with vertebrate pest management. I guess I spend a lot of my time thinking about how we manage country and how we do it in a way that reflects well the old stories, which we see as the land management template. So it's not just these animals belong here and these don't. It's more about what is the story for country and how can we truly reflect that in the way we manage country. Probably what I do, Zena.
Yep. My name's Zena Cumpston. I'm a Barkindji woman. I've got family ties to Broken Hill, Menindee and Wilcannia. I'm also Afghan and Irish. And I have been living here in Melbourne for quite a while, and I'm a visitor on this land, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Greater Melbourne area, the Bunurong and the Wurundjeri mob, and say thanks to their ancestors for keeping us safe on country. I work at the moment at the University of Melbourne as a research fellow. Without sort of wanting to run myself down, I think I do feel all the time that I'm a fake academic. I've only got an undergrad, but I just had a massive passion in the area that a job opened up in, and that's how I kind of ended up working in a uni. So whilst I'm doing academic work, I do often feel like a fish out of water. But at the moment, I'm doing a great job with Science Gallery in collaboration with the Clean Air Urban Landscapes Hub, who I work for. And it's a show called Emu Sky, which looks at basically the way that our ecological knowledge as Aboriginal peoples has been perceived since invasion. And I'm telling the story through contemporary Aboriginal art. So there's over 30 Aboriginal community members involved. It opens hopefully around August. It changes every week and keeps going south. But yeah, so I'm excited at the moment to kind of bring together lots of different parts of my life in my academic circumstance.
Beautiful. So as you can see, we've got a pretty cool crew here, so you're all incredibly lucky. So I would like to just begin this discussion, roundtable, lecture, whatever this is going to end up being, with a quote from your essay, Uncle. And this is, if you haven't read the essay, I would really encourage you to do so, but this is written in a kind of utopian space between the implications and the ongoing effects of the 2020 bushfire season and the futurity, the incredible imagined futurity that we might have if we take responsibility and accountability from those events and lead that towards climate justice and care for country. So that's the context of this quote. Now that the sunlight could reach the ground of the forest and carbon was plentiful, the original grasses returned. How had they done that? Was the seed always there, waiting? We don't know the answer to that yet because we've been too busy harvesting. Redleg and Gurra Nilak returned in abundance. The forest was unrecognisable. We towed our little Mandu harvester through the bush and around the trees, working as quickly as we could before the seed dropped. Kids following our harvester were getting excited about the aroma. The heat from the engine was lightly roasting the grain and the aroma was intoxicating. The kids wanted lunch now. So, Bruce, a lot of this essay is kind of written in a tone and in a context of what some people might describe as idealistic or potentially even naive hope for the future. I want to ask you, and then kind of go, throughout the panel. I want to ask you about what you think is the importance of idealism at this kind of time, and particularly given that this was something that came up in the discussion on Q&A earlier in the week. Why do we need hope? What does hope look like? And what's the relationship between that kind of idealistic hope that you are expressing throughout this essay and the pragmatism that you're constantly measuring that against in terms of what industry might look like transformed, what production might look like transformed? So hope, let's start with that.
Well, it's a lot better than hopelessness, and that's the alternative. I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people on whose land we are here. I'd also like to acknowledge Hilary McPhee, who's, I believe, is in the audience. Massive influence on Australian letters. But in regards to hope, we can't drop our hands. Even if we think that the loss of fish in the Australian waters is irreversible, we can't stop fighting, because then we prevent our children and grandchildren from having an effect on that argument. And I just don't believe that humans really want to continue on the road they're on. I think all the signs are there that younger generations of Australians are refusing to accept the path that their grandfathers set them on. And it's an exciting time to be an Australian, to quote Malcolm Turnbull, who knocked back the Uluru Statement before lunchtime. That's a joke. It's Sunday, you can laugh, you can go to work tomorrow.
We're still really mad about it, though.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think there is hope. I think people can change their minds, will change their minds, and we will have a better Australia, a better world. I just can't imagine that we would give up the opportunity to do it. And there's lots of really practical things we can do to make sure of that future is better than now. And so many of them are industrial answers. Coal, petrol, plastic, all of these things we can do something about. And younger Australians can advise you if you're any doubt about what needs to be done. Your grandchildren, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old kids, they can tell you these things. So don't act like the Prime Minister and say you weren't told. This advice is readily available, and we ought to follow the instruction of science. I think one of the other things that makes me hopeful is Australia conducted itself much better during the COVID campaign than most of the rest of the world. And because our politicians took it seriously, took the science seriously. So I'm just hoping that, having had that experience of reasonable government, that we can look at the plight of Aboriginal people in this country, which is appalling, given the deaths in custody, low health rates, low education rates, low employment rates. These things are solvable. And on the farm, thanks to Andrew Bolt, we're employing quite a lot of Aboriginal people growing food. Now, the maths behind it are pretty simple. I failed Form 3 arithmetic and I worked it out, so it's available to everyone. How come the plethora of employment agencies which are given the responsibility of making sure that Aboriginal people have a job, how come they haven't worked it out? And I'll tell you why. Because every time they get a job for an Aboriginal person or any person, they lose money. So the whole gig is designed for them to keep people unemployed. What kind of system is that? It's a disgrace, and it should be reformed. But I have hope that governments have taken note of what has happened in the last 12 months in our forests, but also in our hospitals, and that we can expect better government in the future. And it's almost inevitable that there'll be more women in Parliament as a result of the last month's joke Parliament, and that means that to every question there'll be different perspectives instead of one perspective. And men need women, and men need the perspective of women, and we'll be a better world if we were able to take the breadth of knowledge from both sectors.
I have to say something now.
I think you do.
Do, Jack, I'm sorry.
In fact, I'm your father, and I'm telling you to.
So I've...
Speak up.
Can't even look up, it's so bright. I'm an ecologist, and they say ecologists die twice. Once when the things that they study die, and then finally when they kick the bucket. It's probably worse than that. We probably study more than one thing, so it's numerous times over our lifetime. But it doesn't need to be that way. I was asked to speak at a conference last year, just before lockdown, to young ecologists who the topic that they'd asked to be spoken to from a range of other professionals in the industry was hope, and how they could have hope and wake up and move forward in the industry, knowing that everything was arrayed against them. And it was a real shock to me, because I'd been way too busy doing stuff to really think about it all that much. You know, it's hard to see the sand trickling through your fingers when you're grasping real hard. And I hadn't thought about it a lot, but I went to this conference, and the answer was pretty straightforward. I mean, the thing that gives me hope is the fact that all you young people are still striving away, even though it may seem really difficult. It's really important, and you're smarter than I am, and more committed to the cause than I am. Of course, we've got hope. The other thing that gives me hope is it's not really all that complicated, is it? We know what we need to do to change, to make the world a better place, and look after country and look after mother, which is what it's all about. It's straightforward. We know that it starts with social equity. You really don't get much done in an unjust society. So we start there, and then we know it really deep down, and we're probably preaching to the converted, but I hope we're not. You know, we know what we eat and what we consume and what we burn and the plastics we use. All of these things are pretty straightforward to fix and think about the way we consume and that we are as a society. So I'm hopeful that the penny will drop. I think 1920 bushfires have to have dropped a few pennies around this country, because it's been pretty obvious that it was coming to those of us who think about this stuff a lot. The way country was mismanaged for 230 years, it finally caught up with us in a really big way. And it's caught up with us before, but that was pretty catastrophic to see so much country. But if you want to talk about hope, what Dad just mentioned, the canopy opened up. So a lot of our forests in southeastern Australia are over-choked with regrowth forest, really dense canopies. And the bushfire actually opened that canopy up for the first time for large tracts of this country from the first time. And those grasses that rely on far more contact with mineral soil and far more sunlight were the first time able to germinate in a big way in a really big flush. And we weren't even used to seeing them. We were looking at the farm at Yumbera going, we don't even know what these grasses are. What poor custodians are we? And that gives you hope. From absolute horror comes an opportunity, and we must take those opportunities as society when we see them.
When I read that, Uncle Bruce, it reminded me of our knowledge and how I perceive it. And I think there's an idea that across the southeast especially, a lot of knowledge and culture has been lost because of the ravages of colonisation. And I remember, Uncle, you once sent me a piece of writing. Sometimes Uncle Bruce sends me stuff to look at, which is wonderful, every now and again. and he spoke about something being lost and important knowledge being lost, and I felt a bit funny about doing it because you're an elder who I greatly respect, but I wrote back to you and I said, I don't think you should say it's lost, Unc, because it lets them off the hook. And I think that when we think of knowledge and things that we need being lost, it means that we don't put effort in. It's the same with country. If we lose hope, she can't get better. And if it was our mother who was sick, we would never lose hope. We would keep trying to help her, and country is our mother. And I think the same about my Barker. I know how devastated it is at the moment, but I don't believe that it will die. I can't believe it, and I have a lot of hope. But I think it's important to remember that our knowledge is like that seed, and there's lots of places where knowledge is still very much intact and being passed down, and there's lots of places that work needs to be done. But if we don't shine the light, we don't see what's there, and if we don't get the light onto those seeds of knowledge, they won't sprout. And I think more resources out to communities where communities are working in partnership with science people and others is kind of the key, because it's that it's using all the tools at our disposal that we have. And I'm really hopeful that we'll start to do that, because there's so much talk about recognising Aboriginal ecological knowledge and how important it is, but it's sort of not being really well integrated into the systems that we have yet. But we must never think that this knowledge is lost anywhere, because it's not. Because every time I've seen the light shone, something new comes up, and we have to keep shining the light.
Can I stay with you for a second, Zena? You work a lot on Aboriginal perspectives, particularly in plant ecology, and you've created resources around Aboriginal plant usage. And now you're working on this new project, Emu Sky, which is also taking that environmental knowledge and extending that into how creative practice and artistic practice can enhance an engagement with that knowledge. But just before we actually started this session, you made the comment that language revitalisation is actually also incredibly central to this work, and you were saying some really, fantastic points there. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the work that you're doing and where, this kind of movement into creative practice and in language revitalisation, different kinds of work that people might not necessarily expect to be so directly involved in ecology if they weren't familiar with Aboriginal knowledge systems and how they are interrelated. Could you talk a bit about that entanglement and those relationships and how you're doing work in that area?
Yeah, I guess the main thing that I'm trying to do is bring the core of myself to my work in academia. And so I always have to have that positionality where I have to look at a project and work out how I do it so that as an Aboriginal woman I can keep my cultural integrity, which is not easy a lot of the time in an institution. And I guess a lot of people don't understand how siloed the way that we build knowledge in institutions is. I mean, I think we have an understanding of it, but I've been really shocked by how compartmentalised things are. And I think it's a really strange way to build knowledge, to not realise that everything feeds into something else, and some of the questions that you need to ask you won't find until someone looks from a completely different perspective. And so I guess with the work that I'm doing with Emu Sky, what I'm trying to do is every part of the show, I'm trying to show a different way or aspect of, I guess, the same thing. So it's our ecological knowledge, but I'm trying to show lots of different facets for people to kind of understand what we're always talking about in terms of Aboriginal culture and knowledge and ways of doing being holistic. So one of the things that I've included in the show is a beautiful work by Dr. Jonathan Jones, who's a Wiradjuri Gamilaroi artist and one of my favourite artists. And it's these incredible grinding stones that he used in an exhibition called Buna Bunanga, which Uncle Bruce and I worked on as well in 2019 for Tarnandy. But what that piece really does, because it's got Uncle Stan Grant Sr. doing a soundscape, it really lets people know that language revival and our health, in terms of the environment, are very much interconnected. And there's so many problems at the moment with language and it not being resourced properly. And Auntie Vicky Cousins speaks about it a lot. So if you ever get a chance to hear her speak, I highly recommend listening to her, because she's been so embedded in language and so passionate about keeping her Gunditjmara language alive. There's a lot in language that is almost, someone said to me that it's like a Da Vinci Code in terms of the environment and ecology. So there's parts of words, just to kind of explain it in a really broad way, that you might notice that it has the same sound as perhaps a word for a plant that's completely, seemingly unrelated. So it could be fire, and this part of the word being in a plant that denotes fire, and it tells you that that plant has an important relationship with fire through language. So that's just a really kind of rudimentary way of explaining it. But I think while we're all looking, hopefully not for Aboriginal people to reverse engineer climate change, because that's not quite possible, but while we're all looking at incorporating different ways of knowing and seeing and different knowledge systems that have been here for the longest time imaginable and clearly work in terms of sustainability, I think it's really important that we understand that there's lots of different parts of Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander culture that need reinvigorations at the same time, because nothing works in isolation.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think that's an incredible point about just that interrelationality and also the intergenerationality of that knowledge, because it's about like working with elders such as, Uncle Stan Grant Senior and such to ensure that that knowledge and that information is presented and represented to newer and younger audiences as much as possible, because otherwise we do lose that to the passage of time, unfortunately. And so finding new methods of increasing like a community literacy and awareness around issues of climate change and how it affects our history and also how it affects young people today is like incredible work. So thank you, like as an Aboriginal person, thank you for doing that, and the impact that has on our communities is amazing. I want to jump over to Jack now, and your work in conservation research and also like applied wildlife and fire ecology, but around or framed in this remark that you made in a really fantastic essay that you wrote for The Guardian last year in the kind of immediate aftermath of the bushfires, where you say that the issue isn't actually that we somehow lack the knowledge of how to transform our society. We don't lack the actual systems. We could put in place all kinds of infrastructure transformations that would encourage sustainability. The issue is that we perhaps lack a vision for our environment. And I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about what you think that vision is that's being that we are lacking, and what that might look like in the context of your work.
Yeah, I think that vision was in the context of just having witnessed those catastrophic bushfires right across southeast Australia, or eastern Australia really, isn't it? Where the mismanagement of forests to a degree has drastically contributed to, I don't really like calling it fuels because they're plants. It frustrates me as an ecologist when people talk about fuel all the time, but let's face it, they're plants. But yeah, that vision or what do we want our landscape to look like is really important, and it's not being picked up well by government agencies who are, we're doing planned burns and mulch breaks based on the principle that we just want to protect life and assets. As a society, we need to make a decision whether that's good enough. If that should be the first priority in what we want within our landscapes. Is it just about preserving life and property, or is it in fact taking care for Mother Earth and how she wants to be and how she wants to arrange herself? But we don't lack for these visions. I mean, if you just want to go back to settler diaries, they explain what the landscape looked like. There's your vision if that's what you needed in writing. But if you want to go a little bit more in depth, then the old stories give you the vision of what the landscape was there. And I mean, I'm really privileged to work with John Boy Clark, who's a Kure-Wurrung man in southwest Victoria, who really describes it beautifully in that he can take you to a place that's as old as and show you all of the language names and the stories behind each of the landscape forms in that area, and they relate to animals. And a dreaming story related to that animal. So well, there's your template, there's your vision. That bit of country needs to support that animal, and it has for a bloody long time. He tells that yarn while standing on a volcanic call that its name is He Who Bears Its Red Teeth, which tells you that those people were there when that volcano was erupting. So I think we sometimes forget just how long Aboriginal people have been here, or we don't really understand it when we say 60,000 years or 80,000 years, but that's how long these societies and these same language groups have been in a singular place, long enough to see the volcanoes erupt and the Victorian volcanic plains and go, that's always been the country for bandicoot. It's a pretty extraordinary thing, and that hasn't changed for 10,000 years since those volcanoes erupted. So that is the way that I try to look at country. You know, we have such a small reserve system for trying to protect all of our biodiversity, and what we've tried to do is, you know, lock up these reserves and fit all of biodiversity and all our plants and animals into these reserves. But we've forgotten the one thing that really made these ecosystems tick, and that's its people. So the mother didn't exist in isolation from people. That's not how this country worked, and you can see what that reduction in people on country has led to. And Zena mentions a lack of resources. Well, you know, how much of your taxes go to managing nature or the ecosystems that we have left to us? It's minuscule. It's embarrassing. So what can you expect if that's the sort of resourcing that you put into it? That country won't look after itself because it hasn't adapted to look after itself. It's missing its people, and we need to put our people back in there, and we need to listen to those old stories because that's the vision and that's what we should be working towards.
Unc, I've got a question for you, but did you want to add anything to that?
Well, no, I'm done.
No, Jack, yeah, your father. Come on.
No.
Big one.
He'll be right.
Big one. Little one's done. You. Did you want to add anything further to that one, or do you want my next question?
I think it was answered really thoroughly.
Beautiful.
So give me an easier one.
Oh, okay, all right. Okay. Oh, Jesus. All right, I'm just going to pick randomly between two that I've got stacked up. Okay, so Teila Watson, in her essay, which I read from earlier in the day, but that was a part of the Gribble series, she talked extensively about humanness. And it's funny, actually, Jackie did bring up this, you know, like what we're missing when we conceptualise a landscape, a reserve landscape, which kind of creates this sort of aesthetic fantasy of preservation of landscape, but it actually forgets that there is an incredibly human role in Aboriginal communities continuing their participation in, you know, kinship networks that involve living and non-living non-human forms of life and the environment. But Teila talks about how each generation we learn to become more human, and settler colonialism impedes that process because it continues to distance us from the land that actually does teach us to become more human and does teach us what kindness and compassion and solidarity looks like in our communities. You've been working not just writing. A lot of people know you predominantly through Dark Emu, but you've been around for a lot longer, and you've been doing work at a community level, organisational level, your own creative practice, but also at the farm. And I would like to hear you talk a little bit about what your life and career in working so directly with environment and working so directly with custodians has taught you about being human and your role as caretaker, custodian, or whatever you conceive that as in relation to the landscape.
I think we're inseparable from the land, and I think world religions, the two major world religions, talk about man having dominion over the earth, and I think we can see how well that has worked, that system, and it's clear that we've misused that dominion, and we need to seek alternative paths, alternative understandings, and Aboriginal people in Australia and Indigenous people from around the world, as far as I can gather, believe that the earth is our mother and that we owe our total responsibility to her. And everything we do has to be of benefit to her, not to denigrate her. And that's an environmental solution. If every time we consider an act, we wonder how that act will impact on Mother Earth, and if it's negative, we do something different, then we'll end up with a far more sustainable world, and hopefully we'll still have interjecting Corellas who are talking quite a lot of sense, I understand. But I think it's so vital for us to be not just dipping our hat at the environment, but becoming actively involved. I was talking to an environmental TV network yesterday, and there were plastic cups on the table, and that's not good enough. We're trying to teach our kids about a sustainable world, and we still can't drink our coffee out of a ceramic cup. We used to drink our water out of a tap. Only 20 years ago, when Melbourne was reputed to have the best water in the world, and within 6 months we were drinking it out of a plastic bottle. At every conference you go to, there's water in a plastic bottle because Coca-Cola deemed it necessary. And we went along with it. We caved in. Both Jack and I are in the CFA. The CFA just love plastic. And we need to argue with our organisations. We need to call up every conference organiser that we go to where they can't be bothered to have real cups and saucers or pay somebody to wash them up at the end of the day or wash your own. These are fundamental questions, and it sounds like we're chipping away at the crust on the outside, but as soon as we start doing that, as soon as we start thinking that, we will start fixing the big problems, and we will vote accordingly. And the people are still in charge. We've just been asleep at the wheel. We can do things. We can be very active. We can have enormous effect, but it will require our energy. We will have to give of ourselves to make sure that our country, our politicians, our organisations change. There's going to be change, but we can't afford to have that change hijacked by people who hate the earth.
This is a follow-up that's potentially something of a provocation. A lot of leftists would argue, and progressively minded people would argue, that placing individual responsibility on community members who are perhaps not the most empowered is not the way, and that we need to instead constantly be organising for the huge corporations, focusing on the big political parties and all of that. Why do you think it's so important that in that organising and in which you do talk about extensively, you do talk about the role of massive companies and conglomerates that are constantly undoing the work of many generations of conservation and sustainability. But why do you think that it is so important to be constantly balancing that individual accountability when many others would attempt to undermine that very point that you make and say, well, we can't, it's too big?
Well, I think we can see from really recent events that unless we change the institutions, that it's going to be very, very hard for the earth to survive. Now, what kind of business model is it if you destroy your market? All those geniuses at business school who aren't trying to correct the environmental damage are destroying their market. And it should be the first thing that business students learn. But the reason that I think we should start at the bottom is because the big organisations like BHP, Rio Tinto, places like that, have become so big, so strong, and so endowed with legal advice that they can survive killing populations in Brazil and then paying them chewing gum money in compensation. And then the world accepts that is going to be sufficient. After Australia's lukewarm response to the detonation of that art cave in the Northern Territory, 40,000-year-old art, BHP removed, it was Rio Tinto removed a couple of people from their board, and they're subsequently on another board. You know, they've just gone sideways, and that the public accepted that that was enough. 3 weeks later, BHP also destroyed Australian Aboriginal art. So the reaction to Rio Tinto virtually caused BHP to feel emboldened to do it. So we're not changing those organisations. You know, the Fairfax Press, ABC can put the truth in front of the public, but if that doesn't result in real action, then life just rolls on. The news cycle goes on to, you know, a knee injury to a sports star or something, and everyone is happy. So if that's not going to work, then we have to work with individuals. We have to work really hard with the individuals, and I think we have to have this really hard dialogue with neighbours, workmates that we don't particularly like. You know, Jack said before, we're all fellow travellers here. You know, we would agree on 85% of the world's problems probably, but we need to have more difficult conversations with people we don't particularly like, because that is the way we get change. And that's hard, it'll be unpleasant, but it can be surprisingly useful in terms of the world. And that's the way I hope we would go, that we would be courageous, we would be uncomfortable, but ultimately we will be successful, because the alternative can't be countenanced.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'd encourage you to clap at that. Well, on the topic of kind of modelling the change that you want to see and creating these examples in industry and productivity and all of these sorts of spaces, could I hear a bit about Black Duck Foods? And I might ask you to tell us a bit about that, Jack.
Yeah, sure. So we when did we do that? A few years ago, a couple of years ago, started Black Duck Foods.
Well, I'll definitely fact check you on that, exactly the date that it began. When was the ABN registered?
Well, that's probably a more important question. Might have been operating out of Pascoe Publishing for a while. Yeah, so a couple of years ago, I find timelines in COVID a bit difficult. It all seems to have compressed a little bit. But so we've been operating for a couple of years. The idea is to reinvigorate Aboriginal agriculture. So the old fella bought a farm up the Wallagarah River, and we've been starting to grow grains on that property and tubers. The bushfires actually gave us a bit of win, and after ripping through the paddocks a few times, some new grasses started to occur and allowed us to harvest properly for the first time. Competed with the kikuyu. The fire knocked the kikuyu back, which is, if anyone knows anything about kikuyu, is a bit of an event. But our idea is not just to support the farm. Our idea is to see this model of food production supporting Aboriginal communities across the country to be producing the right foods on the right country. And if Black Duck Foods does nothing other than sell a story that Aboriginal people can use country that's clapped out for a whole range of agricultural purposes, but it can start growing the grains and the foods that have been there for a long time, and we can see those benefits, then that's really what Black Duck Foods is about. Not only about the environmental benefits of growing these plants, but also about seeing people back on country and caring for country in the way it should be. we can talk for a long time about the environmental benefit of having some of these plants back on country. I mean, perennial grasses, you don't need to know much about soil ecology to know just how beneficial perennial grasses are for the construction of soil, and how the removal of those perennial grasses and plants, how much damage that's done to the soil across Australia. So in and of itself, that's a win. Some of these plants will just begin to restore some of the damage that's been done to country for 230 years. So that's it, in essence. We're just trying to grow the foods that belong to country, grown by the people who belong to country, and that's probably our mission. I think there's probably about 6 or 7 objectives that we have in our constitution, but neither of us are going to remember them for you now, I'm afraid.
And you employ blackfellas in the organisation?
Yeah, we do. So we're on Yuin country, and we're employing 4 or 5 Yuin people to do that work on country on Dad's farm, but also have been out scoping other plants and opportunities right across Yuin territory. So it's really exciting work.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for explaining a bit about that. Kind of on this idea as well as constantly ensuring that we are centering, the custodians in the country, whether we're doing conservation work or, industry building or whatever it is. Zena, you had an article in the conversation where you talked a lot about your work in plant ecology and Aboriginal perspectives on plant ecology, but you had this phrase that really struck out to me, not as consultants but custodians. So I wanted to ask a bit about your experience working across like a multitude of different sectors and research spaces as well that you've touched on. How do you feel the role of Aboriginal participation has transformed across your own career, and where do you think that is heading now?
Yeah. I guess I'm really emerging in the area that I've come into. I didn't go to uni till I was 35, and then I accidentally got pregnant and went, oh my God, I was meant to be going to honours and going overseas to study, and that didn't happen. So I guess I'm fairly new, and I should just preface what I'm going to say with that. But I do see that there's like a really big push, which I guess touched on before, to include Aboriginal people and knowledges in more mainstream projects, and especially in academia. But I see that there's like a bit of a problem with that. It's quite a large problem actually. Tony Birch actually wrote a wonderful essay which ended up appearing in a book about, it's by, I'll have to remember it in a minute. It's basically about the ways in which you'd think that ecologists and the green movement would be absolutely
that was
collaboration.
University of Western Australian Press. That was published in like 2017 or something like that.
Yeah,
it was like Indigenous climate relations or something like that. If you Google, climate.
Yeah, I didn't know I was going to mention it, but yeah. But basically it talks about how fraught things are in that space, because I think a lot of the time I see in projects that I'm asked to be involved in, not all of them, but there's this problem where people even talk about it being Aboriginal-led, and then you actually look at what's going on in the project and you realise that the Aboriginal person who's supposed to be leading it is actually being run ragged on about 15 other different parts of the project. And really the Aboriginal-led part of it is sometimes quite problematic, in that most often projects seem to have an inception that happens without mob. And so if you are working out what your project is without any mob involved, it's very unlikely that that project will deliver any gains for Aboriginal community members and individuals. So I think that's kind of an ongoing problem that happens, and I don't know for sure, but a lot of the things that come to me, I see this fundamental issue with it not truly being Aboriginal-led. And I think in terms of environmental practice in Australia, it seems like that same sort of thing's going on. And if we were actually given a real opportunity to really lead, I feel like it's something we haven't tried before.
Yeah.
And it could be really powerful. And I am part of another collaboration that's to do with futures thinking with Alex Kelly and David Pledger, and we just did a recording the other day, and we were talking about a fanciful kind of future, and in that future I was saying that I kind of made up this crazy thing that basically the government ended up having to give personage to my Barker, the Darling River. And they had to do that in my fantasy because they were worried that they were getting international pressure to give traditional owners water rights, because my Barkindji mob, we got native title, I think, in 2015 after more than 18 years and centuries of fighting, but we don't have any water rights, which is kind of ridiculous. So there's this thing going on in that story where you can see that, you know, you're saying that you're giving people power over country, but without water, what power can we have? Our bark is completely fucked, basically, and so that means our country's fucked. I think we all need to think, when we're wanting to include Aboriginal perspectives and people, the first thing that we need to think about is reciprocity, and we need to think about what would this project bring to community, and the best way to work that out is to bring mob on right from the start and have a conversation about what your project is, and make sure that people are at the table at the start. But not only are they at the table, they're also able to set the menu.
Yep. No, that's amazing. Jack, did you want to jump in?
It's stark, isn't it? Everywhere we go, there's that expectation that there's going to be a black fella waiting in the wings to tell you what your project is, even though the project's been shaped 3 or 4 years ago. But also, we often get this thing where, particularly in environmental projects, I think if any of you made Victor's speech earlier where you know, black fellas and fire is super sexy at the moment. And so there's this bit of a expectation that agencies are going to come away from meeting with Aboriginal people with a recipe book for how to sort out all the issues with country, and it's going to be like that, you know. And it's wonderful, and Victor represents an extraordinary practice that's been passed on for a very long time, and that is represented right across the country in different ways. But we almost don't want to give you the recipe book. We want you to take away the mindset, because it's not just about fixing problems as they occur. It's about understanding that it's about looking after country first, because you're part of country. So, I mean, you're looking after yourself. But it's not just, you know, spot ignition fires against the wind at the right time of year. It's also about why you're doing it and why it's important, and what it is that you're doing for country when you go about it. So sometimes it's just that recipe book that people are after, but we want to give you more.
Yeah. No, amazing. And actually on that, I was going to go over to Bruce, but I might stay with you for a second, Jack. A question that I really like asking people that tends to terrify them is...
Right.
It's kind of influenced by this incredible activist and researcher who I believe is Anishinaabe from Turtle Island. Her name is Eve Tuck, and she talks about research and her activism being the things that she knows that she needs to do. She knows that as an Indigenous person, she's called to do these things, that we have responsibilities that are beyond what our desire is, but that she also always needs time to do the things like to bathe her children, to do their hair, to teach them, to do care, that kind of caring work, and that she wants to be able to do the things that she loves as a part of her activism, but sometimes feels like that's beyond her. I'd like to ask all of you, but I'm going to stay with you for a second. You're doing the work that you're doing because you've obviously been called into that responsibility. You also have a family that's obviously incredibly environmentally conscious and aware, and you have that knowledge, capacity, that resource and access to do that. If you felt like you were somebody unencumbered by the demands placed upon Aboriginal people to be constantly fixing settler colonial problems, how do you think you would show your love, your care, your custodianship of country if you did not have to be constantly encountering or negotiating the settler colonial state's demands upon you for that?
Not constantly coming to Melbourne to speak.
Fair cop. We like you here, though.
And I don't think you could say that my daughter's particularly environmentally conscious at the moment. She just cares that she's well fed, I think, is probably a fair
Isn't
statement.
she 2.5, Jack?
Yeah, mate.
Yeah, okay.
She just needs to be fed. Oh, look, I grew up in the scrub. We live on... I grew up on Gadabanud country, which is the furthest east of the Ma peoples of southwestern Victoria. And I love that bit of country. It's pretty extraordinary. So Cape Otway is where I'm talking about. It's sort of rolling sandy dunes that sort of fall away to cliffs at a number of beaches where, I've been living off abalone and crayfish most of my life. Less so these days because busy. But and also the fish aren't doing quite as well as they were when I was a kid. So I don't really know how to answer your question other than the fact that I think I'd just still be working on looking after that bit of country. For those of you who don't know, that the forests of Cape Otway suffered a massive destruction from overabundant koalas. They actually ripped the entire canopy out, which caused the environment there to turn on its head. I don't know whether Victor talked about upside down country earlier, but basically we had all the scraggly dead trees standing up above the mid-story, and it was heart-wrenching to watch what had been really, really beautiful country, wasn't it, Dad? Like, it was pretty extraordinary. Everywhere you walked, you felt like you were just under a pretty thin canopy of beautiful white manna gum trees, and an imbalance in that ecosystem because there was no mob to keep the koala numbers down, or there were no dingoes to do the same. It just absolutely ripped the guts out of it. And so I'd probably be just doing that, looking after that bit of country, because that's when I'm happiest, is doing those hands-on things and looking after the bits of country which I probably consider myself custodian.
Yeah.
How many trees did you plant, Jack? Over how long?
I don't know. It's probably written in my masseur's bill, I guess. I've planted a lot of trees. Happy to have done it.
Well, I'll answer the question. Jack virtually replanted that forest, the Cape Otway forest. The manna gum disappeared because of mismanagement. Strangely, it was more healthy when there were cattle on it, because the cattlemen burnt the country. And in the 20 years after the cattle left, the country deteriorated. All the trees died, and he replaced them.
I mean, you probably can't be
In
prouder.
fairness, they're that big still, so there's a little way to go.
They'll get bigger. I think I know how plants work. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'd like to hear an answer. I'd like to hear from both of you your answer. If you felt that you were unencumbered by the demands that settler colonial Australia has placed upon you as an Aboriginal person to correct their mistakes, how do you feel? What do you think you would be doing? And how's country a part of that?
I don't think I'd be doing much different. I would be talking to young Aboriginal kids, hoping to get them to work on the farm for us, because we're going to need more and more people. We've harvested 4 properties in the last year, and we've got demands to harvest another 6 or 7. We don't have the people. So I talk to a lot of kids, Aboriginal kids from Eden, and I beg them to finish school. I ask them to stop smoking. I ask them to treat their girlfriends properly. They get very sick of me, but some of them do come and work on the farm, and then we start talking about looking after the ground, looking after the earth, and we have those conversations about loving Yuin land. And so I don't know that I would do anything differently, and I think it's really important for me not to be talking about it, but to be doing it. And I live on the banks of the Wallagra River, and like Jack, I feel like I'm looking after that bit of ground with the help of local Yuin people. We're in a business partnership with a local Aboriginal mob, and one of the reasons why I don't think I'd do anything differently is because I don't really want to be away from the land. She's my mother, the river is my artery, and I'm locked in.
Beautiful.
We would have both been at the football though, like, in fairness.
And the lady with the hawthorn scarf down the back, I feel really sorry for you, darling.
All right. Zena, how would you answer that?
Well, I know we're out of time, so I'll be really quick. I sometimes do feel a huge burden, but I also think I realise my privilege that people want to hear what I have to say, which I almost can't believe, and it's such an honour to be here with you all today, and especially you, Uncle Bruce, because Uncle Bruce really opened up the conversation about plants and country in a way that no one had before, and that book hit at exactly the right time. And I think all the time I reflect on the fact that I'm not sure that the rivulet that I'm getting pulled along in at the moment would even be there if it weren't for the work you've done. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Thank you so much, Uncle Bruce, Jack, Zena, for your incredible contributions. You can read all of their work online. Obviously, you can read Bruce's essay on the Wheeler Centre website, but I really would encourage you also to look up Jack and Zena's work, the different projects that they're working on at the moment, but also some of the previous writings that they've been doing over the last couple of years. It's incredibly informative and really rich work. So can you please join me in thanking them? And again, I would just really like to thank and acknowledge all of the sponsors that have made this event possible. Also the Malthouse Theatre, the Wheeler Centre, also to Linda and Amber for your incredible interpretation work. And again, also different workers who are making sure that this event is as COVID safe as possible. So with them in mind, would you mind, just as the event closes up, if you could just vacate your tables when you're ready. I'm not trying to kick you out, but they all do need to be properly cleaned and sterilised for the next event that we have later on. So if you could just make sure that you're helping all of the workers here as much as possible, that'd be great. And you can go and get... I'm assuming they've at least got Dark Emu, which I hope you've all got anyway, but go over there anyway. Go. Readings is our booksellers. Support independent booksellers as much as possible. You can go over there, and if you purchase a book, hopefully Uncle Bruce will be around for you to sign it. So big thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening.
Visit wheelercentre.com for the best in books, writing and ideas from Melbourne, Australia and around the world.